Right, so even going back to when I first owned this BMW, there was a faint smell of diesel fumes in the cabin. I ignored it to start with because it wasn't a major thing, and I thought I'd just figure it out as time went on. Then the timing chain failed, then other things have gone. I thought I may have got to the bottom of it with the leaky fuel return hose on the injectors, which I thought might have been making a diesel fume sort of smell. Although I fixed that, it's not what's causing it, and it's got worse as well. And I believe really now I may have a cracked EGR cooler. And many of you may know there's an alert out there from BMW to recall lots of these EGR coolers. Mine's been into BMW, they've checked it for the part of the EGR that the recall covers, and they've said it's fine. On the other hand, I can't be asked to argue with BMW over this. So I've just bought another EGR cooler, an EGR altogether. I've actually bought a used one, not a brand new one, because it's expensive to buy a brand new one. And also, I just want to fit it myself and I don't want it to cost the earth. And it might not fix the problem, you don't really know. I've had a good sniff around the engine bay. I'm 95% sure it's coming from around the EGR using my special tool. You can just smell it around the sort of right hand side of the EGR cooler. Can't see any fumes, can't see anything, but you can smell it, and it's at low revs when the EGR is beginning to open that you smell it the most. I also had a drivetrain error that cropped up, and I've noticed the DPF has intermittently logged an error that says it's fairly clogged, and I know the EGR and the DPF are intertwined with their function. The joys of owning a high mileage diesel vehicle with all these emissions controls equipment on, eh? But that's what it is. So here's what I bought. So, fresh from eBay. All I did was went and ordered the best looking part from the lowest mileage vehicle that I could find. And I can tell you now, because I've had my EGR out before, when I was doing the work on the engine, this is in far better shape, just visibly all over, than mine is. I've taken the cover off here just to have a look at the little the arm that opens and closes the EGR. It's buttery smooth and clean. This EGR doesn't have half the signs of life that mine has had all over it. So anyway, this the things I was looking for, by the way, are cracks that you see on this. It's not very flexible, but the whole point of this sort of corrugated tubing here is so that it flexes ever so slightly, and also this tubing here, you can get cracks on these, but this is in pretty good order from what I can see, and I can tell you it's in a hell of a lot better shape than my EGR is outside. So I just need to remove my EGR and pop this one back in. 5-minute job, eh? It's not quite that easy. And I do recall it was a bit of a pain in the ass to get it out the first time round, just because I was trying to do it without removing the cooling fan at the back of the radiator. But it can be done. I got the old one out and I got the new one in. The thing is, you got to remember, when you're removing it, it's going to drop a load of coolant out of the engine block, because on the back here, the coolant, if I turn it all the way over, there we go. So this side here is what is against the back of the engine block, and there is a little port here and a little port here which lets the coolant go in and out of the cooler. There you go. And that also gets fed into the actual EGR valve, which is this part here, via these little tubes. Now these don't need to come off now that I'm not doing anything with the EGR valve. I'm just going to bolt the whole unit back in. So we just need to make sure that this and this seal up nicely. There's short little bits of what look like 15mm speed fit, like what you do plumbing in your house with, and they've got an O-ring on each end, so we're just going to make sure that goes on nicely. I have fashioned a little tool here to capture the coolant as I pull it off. I thought about draining the whole thing down again of coolant and doing it that way, but what I think I'll actually do is just pull the EGR off once I've got the 3 bolts out. You can see there's 3, 1, 2, 3 mounting points. I'll just pull it off, shove this down, and as the liquid spurts out, I shall capture as much of it as I can there. Some will go on the floor and I'll put a bucket underneath, and we'll just do the fill procedure at the end. So that's the plan. Let's get on with it. Okay, so unfortunately I'm being punished by the British weather. So just thought I'd start us off now. So these two bolts here, which bolt the end of the EGR onto the intake manifold, 10mm, they're captive bolts, so they won't come out. They'll just remove to about there and they won't budge. Then we need to remove this bolt that I've just wound out, and this bolt, and that is going to remove this plastic electrical assembly that just sits in our way, and then hopefully we can just pull that out of the way a little bit, and then we should have access to the actual bolts that hold the EGR in place. Now there are two bolts on the actual connector that you can't quite see down there on that golden flexy bit, and then 3 bolts on the actual EGR itself. So while it's chucking down with rain, I'm just going to get those loosened off and see where we are. Okay, a few minutes of pushing, pulling and unplugging. I've pretty much just unplugged all of the things that connected into here. Don't be afraid, there's a few of them. There's this little, I think it's a temperature sensor on the outlet of the EGR. There's the swirl flap actuator, the fuel rail connector, the temperature sensor for the engine block. This little solenoid valve connector has to come off. The connector for the actual EGR has to come off. Just unplug them all. They can't be plugged back in wrong, so don't panic about it. And just took them up out of the way, and that's what I've done here. I've removed this little part of the intake, which is over here now, just to give me some handy room to get in here. And then we've now got this tucked up and out of the way, and now we can get into the space to see the whole EGR. Now we've just got to unbolt that little dude and fetch him out, and then spill a load of stuff in the process, bit of coolant everywhere, try and catch it in our little special container that I made, and refit the new one. That's where we are. Let's get it done. Okay, as you can see from this, my little contraption did not work at all. The EGR is now out, and I've got the end of my ratchet just sort of temporarily blocking the bottom half there, although most of the coolant has come out of the block. I just thought I'd show you the difference between the old EGR and the new one that's going in. We can see quite clearly there's 2 big cracks in this tube here, which I think is the bypass for the exhaust. That's why it's so black all over the EGR here. That's just soot from the exhaust, and you can't see that so much because it's the underside of the EGR that's tucked away. You can't really see it, and you definitely can't see this until you remove the EGR. But yeah, cracks, one big one and one just beginning here, and that's where all the exhaust gases and the smells coming from. Anyway, this one, nice and new, hardly used at all. It is a used item, but not used very much. So let's get it put straight in. Okay, new EGR is bolted in place just with 3 bolts, the one here, the one under there, and the one down there. I'll tell you now, if you want to save your hands from being absolutely battered, you're better doing this the proper way, which is to unbolt the 2 braces here, remove this panel here, pulling out the fan, and that'll give you a whole lot more room to work with to get your hands in here. I haven't done that because probably false economy, but I didn't fancy doing that, if I'm honest. And I know that the EGR came out when I did all the work on the engine without taking the fan out. It's just difficult, that's all. So I'd suggest, if you want an easier life, you've got a few more bolts and a few more bits to take off to get this panel off to get to the radiator fan underneath. But anyway, that's probably the better way to do it. Right, so 3 bolts are done up now. What I'm going to do is this is a little vacuum hose that connects onto this solenoid just here. I'm going to trim this off just because it's looking a little widened where it is there. Don't know if you can tell in the video. So I'm just going to trim that off, make it a bit shorter, and get a better, nice tight seal when we connect onto there. And then I'm going to just reassemble everything. Put the section of my intake back in again. That's the throttle body, that's the intake manifold. It's still a bit dirty in there because I never quite got inside this bit to clean it, but I'm not too worried about a bit of soot right now. Let's just get it cleaned off, bolt it all back up together, everything plugged back in, and then see if our exhausty smell has gone. And it might help with the DPF regeneration and all that as well. So let's get cracking. Right, don't know if you can see, I've just trimmed a nice end off this vacuum line. So I'm just gonna try and push him back on. In fact, it might be easier if we just pull this off. There we go. Let's get a nice tight connection on that valve. There we go. And then he just clips onto this little part right here. Happy days. Right, now next I need to do the 2 bolts up that connect the exhaust manifold down here. Let's do that. Okay, so here we have this little connector which just marries up to the exhaust manifold right here, and we have 2 bolts like this which do it. The top one you can see nice and easy, and then the bottom one, just to make life really easy for us, is completely unseen and a little awkward to get to, but not as awkward as the bolt that bolts the underside of the EGR valve in up on the engine block. That one I've already done, and that was the worst one. Right, so let's just get this in and get it finger tight. Let's get it in. Let's see if I can get my hand in without knocking the camera. Right then, everything is now plugged back in, bolted back up, put me a bit of intake plastic tubing back in. It's all pretty much ready. Now, of course, the coolant fill procedure is something that's a little bit different. Look how filthy that is around there. Anyway, I filled a fair bit that just goes straight in. But the fill procedure is to go inside, and we're going to activate the electric pump, which is going to pump the liquid around and get rid of some of the bubbles, and then we refill it again. Okay, so we're all done now. The engine's running, coolant's all nice and full. I'm glad to get this unit out, really. That's where we knew the cracks were in the end. All this blackness is a good indication, although you can't really see that when it's in the car because it's underneath. Another point is that this, there you go, sometimes sticks as well. Despite me greasing it up, this part of the EGR operation can be sticky on lots of cars, and yeah, and it sticks sometimes, which is just something else that's oh, there you go, that was a real bad stick. Anyway, yeah, for many reasons I'm just glad to get this old knackered EGR out and the new one in. And if you've got problems with fumes in the cabin and you've exhausted every other possibility, it's time to look at the EGR. So yeah, there you go. It's not the easiest job, but needed doing.